Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about a fundamental question about morality, and that's the question of whether morality or ethics is objective or subjective. And we'll define those words more carefully later on. For now, objective just means there are facts, there are truths of the matter. Your views can be mistaken, something like that. Subjective means we just make it up as we go, is what humans decide is what goes, morally speaking. Morality just is our beliefs about morality. Morality just is our practices. There are no truths or facts that we can get wrong when we say moral things, when we engage in moral behavior. We'll make those things more careful as we move on. For now, that should be enough to give you a sense of what the question that we're asking. And the question is ethics, is morality objective or subjective? When we say something is right, something is wrong, something is just, are we trying to describe reality as it is? Or are we doing something else? Are we merely articulating our perspectives, our beliefs that are not reflective of the way the world is or the way reality is? That's the basic question for us. So let us begin with Mary Migley, her great article on trying out one new sword. And I really like this article for several reasons. One of which is that she makes explicit some thoughts, some tendencies, some attitudes that are dominant in our society. And in making them explicit, now we can assess them. We can take a step back and ask whether or not those attitudes or tendencies in our society are correct. Are they true? Are they false? Are those the right way of thinking about morality? And if you don't make explicit those tendencies, those attitudes, you don't assess them. You just think through them, right? You just perpetuate them. You just keep, do what people do in that context. And one of the beauties of philosophy in general, of thinking in general, of reflecting in general, in this particular case, one of the beauties is that you can articulate the thing. And once you articulate it, you can think about it, you can assess it, you can reflect upon it. You can then question whether or not it's true or false, try to look at reasons for it and reasons against it, and then develop your more reasonable perspective on the matter. Your more likely to be true perspective on the matter, and in this case, morality. How should we think of the nature of morality? So there's a way of thinking that she calls moral isolationism. And moral isolationism is a collection of claims, a collection of ways of thinking about the world, but they're kind of relatively cohesive, like they come together in different ways. And that's the fairly dominant way of thinking. A lot of people think this anyway, and she's going to argue against it. So moral isolationism is going to be the target to be argued against by Mary Migley. Here's one of the claims that compose the view of moral isolationism. And it's the claim that we can never fully understand a culture different from our own. We understand reality through the lenses or the assumptions or the beliefs that are constitutive of our culture. We see the world through our cultural perspective, our cultural stand. We can do no other but understanding reality from a particular angle. And that angle is unchangeable. We cannot escape it. We're trapped in our own culture inevitably. Everyone is. Furthermore, cultures are like sealed units. They're sharply divided from one another. Like the picture I have here, they're like islands. Things can happen within the islands. You can have people, have societies, activities, and things like that. And part of what is being depicted or trying to be depicted by this picture is that there is no walking from one island to the other. The kind of activities you can do by walking and things like that are limited to the island. There is no escaping it. The assumption is boats and things like that are not allowed, right? This picture is supposed to capture not just spatial distance, but a different kind of distance, a more profound kind of distance, a distance in systems of thought. And systems of thoughts are just ways of looking at the world, ways of understanding reality, ways of interpreting reality. And those are sealed from one another. They are part of the culture. They kind of embody the culture, but they're not shareable. Like there's no way of talking past them. And morality is part of the system of thought. The way people behave in one of these islands is structured by their morality, which is structured by the way they look at the world, their system of thoughts, but that's only applicable to their island. It cannot be taken to a different island. There's no such transgressing, there's no such escaping, there's no such transcending. the island. That's part of the isolation part of moral isolationism. And that's the basic thing. And here are some of the things that follow from that basic assumption about cultures being sealed units. Judging, that is, making moral assessments of other cultures, is unacceptable. It's unacceptable because it typically comes from naivete or ignorance. When you judge another culture, you're exposed to something different, and you judge it as bad or unacceptable, unjust. The moral isolationist will frown upon you and would say, you're being naive, you're being ignorant, you're misapplying the moral code of your culture onto another culture. But there's no such, that's not applicable. It's like the island. You're trying to impose the traditions of this island into that island, but it has a different tradition. Like, you just don't understand the way the world is, morally speaking. Morality, says the moral isolationist, is like a coinage, like a currency, like cash, but that is only valid within the territory of the country, of the island. It's not accepted elsewhere. It has purchase here, but only here. Elsewhere, it's just a piece of paper. And that's the case for all moralities, because they're dependent on cultures. So to apply your morality, your judgments to a different culture is necessarily to misapply them. Because they don't have purchase there. They don't belong there, right? Morality belongs to a system of thought which is located within a culture, which is essentially separated from other cultures. So that's the heart of moral isolationism. It's a claim about what morality is. And the question for us is this the right way of thinking about morality? Is this how morality functions? Is this what morality is? And she's going to argue that it's not, and I'm going to try to convince you that she's correct, or at least invite you to think that she's correct, and then you come to your own conclusions. So why would one endorse or think that moral isolationism is true? Why would one want to be a moral isolationist? And it has a good kind of motivation. Typically, a view like this, or a collection of views like this, is motivated by something good, something like respect. It is wrong to judge other cultures because it is disrespecting them. Respecting other cultures demands that you fail to apply your system of morality onto their practices. That's the claim. Is this a good claim? Is this a good reason for the view? One of the main things that happens in the article is that she argues persuasively that it is not a good reason. Respect is great, but it does not give you moral isolationism, for a very simple reason. Respect itself is a moral notion. Respect itself is a kind of moral judgment. To respect another culture is essentially to judge them positively, favorably, but judge them nonetheless. So it is impossible to truly respect another culture without judging them and without understanding them. To respect a culture is in part to judge them positively and to say that they are worthy of respect, and to say that you must understand enough of them so you can be justified in your judgment that they are worthy of respect. Typically, such a judgment would presuppose things like the belief that the judgment that people have intrinsic dignity and value, that they have the right to hold or to structure themselves as they see fit, to make their own cultures, and that people that try to impose themselves upon those cultures are transgressing that right that the other people have. But notice that talking about dignity, talking about rights, talking about respecting dignity and respecting rights and so on, all of those are moral judgments. Those are not moral isolationist judgments. They are objectivist judgments. They're judgments that try to describe the way the world is, morally speaking, and saying that those moral facts about how people are, namely they have value and dignity, impose obligations and limitations and constraints on others to treat them appropriately, to not disrupt their cultures. But to think that is to abandon moral isolationism, is to cease to be an isolationist and to endorse objectivism, the view that there are moral facts and that you're articulating one of them. So that's the other bullet point. To respect something is at least to have a favorable moral appraisal of that thing. It is to say something like, it is worthy of being let be, right? To allowing us, the thing there is worthy of allowing us to let it exist. It is to recognize a value there. But that's all of those are moral judgments. And there's a cool example, and this is what the source of the title for the article. And this is an example of samurais. So there used to be an old Japanese culture in which there was a sharp distinction between two different classes. There were the samurai, which were the warriors. They dedicated themselves to practicing, the art of war, sword fighting, and so on. And there were a different class, which were most people, and there were the commoners. There were the workers, the ones, tilled the land. They work in the fields. They provided the food for the rest of the society. So the warriors would be the higher class, the ones that get the benefits of the work, the labor of the lower class, the commoners. But there was a kind of reciprocity going on. The commoners also got the benefit of the warriors defending the land. So when invaders will come in to try to loot the village or something, the samurai would get the swords and be the warriors, right? It was their responsibility to defend the group, the entire group, including the commoners. So the commoners would get the benefit of relative peace and stability, and the samurai would get the benefit of some of the fruits of the labor of the commoners. So that's the basic picture. But within the basic picture, there was this particular tradition, this particular practice, and that is the focus of attention for the article. When samurais needed new swords, there was the recognition that they were very valuable. Swords must be ideal. They must, not be too heavy, be strong enough they don't break easily, they don't be sharp enough they can cut through people's bodies. And a lot hang on that, right? If a warrior, a samurai would go into battle and have a defective sword that would easily break or something, he can lose his life. He might more likely lose his life than otherwise. He might lose the battle, and then the whole village might, be in serious trouble. So everyone recognized the importance of there being good swords for the samurai. So when the samurai needed a new sword, he would go to the sword maker, and the sword maker would make the sword. And before he would test it in battle, because that's the real test, he would try it out. So the practice was that he would come from the sword maker, get his sword, and just walk into the street, right? Walk into the village. And the first non-samurai, the first commoner he will come across, he will cut in half. And everyone knew this, right? The practice was widely spread. Everyone knew that when a samurai came out, to test his sword, the first person he sees, the first commoner he sees, will be the test subject. And so he will try to cut them in half. If the sword was not sharp enough, they'll get stuck halfway. He will go back to the sword maker and say, hey, make it sharper. If the sword was too thin that it will break, he will go back and say, hey, it was too thin, give me another one. If the sword was able to cut through the commoner in one swift movement, then great, it was a great sword, he can go to battle, right? So of course, one of the obvious consequences of this is that commoners would get cut in half every once in a while. So that's the practice, trying out your new sword. Here's a question for us outsiders, not members of that society. Can we judge that practice? Can we say something like, they shouldn't do that, that's immoral? Or can we say something like, well, there are bad consequences, but all things considered, that's a justifiable practice? Notice that's a different kind of judgment. Do we know enough? Can we know enough to make moral assessments of those very different kinds of practices? The moral isolationist says, no, stop it. You can't, you're not a part of the culture. Mary Midglade says, yes, we can, at least in principle. We can make bad judgments. We can make hasty judgments, right? We can make ignorant judgments. We can make naive judgments. But we can also, at least in principle, make well-informed, accurate, intelligent, reasonable judgments about this very practice. Every time we look at a different culture, we should take our time to look at it carefully. We should take our time to assess all of the relevant, to identify and assess all of the relevant factors. But at some point, we can, in principle, judge accurately those moral practices. And to say that, to think that, is to abandon moral isolationism, is to think that morality is not the way in which the moral isolationist describes it. So if you're tempted to think that I can, at least in principle, perhaps now, judge that that practice of cutting people in half is immoral. Why? Because they could easily replace the person with something else that it, has the same kind of density and so on. Some other adequate replacement, and they can cut those things in half. And surely it will be less expensive for in terms of human value to cut those things, to make those things and cut those things, than to cut persons. So they should have done that. Right? If you think you can say those things justifiably, you are tempted to, or perhaps have already abandoned moral isolationism as the right view. So here's what she thinks. She thinks that that's the correct way of thinking. And here are more reasons for thinking the moral isolationism is false, and that way of thinking about the trying out one's new sword is the right way of thinking. One that can gradually become an accurate way of judging different culture. So problem number 2 with moral isolationism. It certainly seems that outsiders can recognize praiseworthy aspects or parts of a different culture. So if you haven't traveled much around the world, I highly encourage you to do so. Traveling is great. It's very eye-opening. You get to see other cultures, especially see them from within, not the superficial touristy look, but you see the cultures happening from within. And you will see things. And by seeing those things, they will reflect back some of your culture. You'll be able to understand your own culture better. You'll see things like whether or not their democracy is more sound than yours or less sound than yours. You can see whether their parenting practices are more effective, more loving than yours. You can see, for example, the equality of the sexes or lack thereof, sexism, and so on in other societies. And by being exposed to other cultures and being able to understand them and judge them appropriately, you'll come to be better equipped to judge your own culture. That just seems to be a fact of, empirical fact about we humans. We can do that. We do it successfully. We do it effectively. And the fact that we do so is an indication that moral isolationism is false because it claims that we can't. But of course, praising and recognizing good things in other cultures requires ability to understand and also ability to criticize. We can see the bad and the good. That's kind of a package deal. So that's the second problem for moral isolationism. And perhaps more importantly for our purposes, at least very importantly for our purposes, the third problem is that if you take moral isolationism seriously, it blocks or prevents thinking about morality or moral reasoning. The ability to judge yourself, your actions, other people's character, practices, societies, on the basis of whether they're right or wrong, just or unjust, and so on. It prevents the very mechanism of thinking that gives rise to wanting to have a good society, a just society, a better society. If you think that you are incapable of judging other cultures, you will not be able to really understand your own as well, and therefore it will be hard for you to try to push for a more just society, a less racist society, a more less sexist society, a more equal society, and so on. You cannot really push for that unless you're capable of engaging in moral reasoning, and moral isolationism deprives you of that. It undermines the very possibility of ethical thinking for the sake of bringing about a better world. So that's a serious problem for the view, because surely we can, in fact, we do it all the time, that we try to bring about a better world. So the view says that moral judgment is in some sense impossible. And Miglid argues that it's not impossible, it's necessary. We have to do it. So what is a moral judgment? Moral judgment is just forming a moral opinion. And here's a cool quote from the text. The power of moral judgment is in fact not a luxury, not a perverse indulgence of the self-righteous. It is a necessity. When we judge something to be to be bad or good, better or worse than something else, we are taking it as an example to aim at or avoid. Those judgments become the very things we do or must do for us to grow ethically and morally. How can we become good unless we have a sense of what goodness is, right? Like there's no way around making judgments if one wants to grow in virtue, in goodness. Without opinions of this sort, or judgments of this sort, we will have no framework of comparison for our own policy making, no chance of profiting by other people's insights or mistakes. If all cultures are on the par, it's hard to recognize that, say, Nazi Germany with Hitler did something wrong that we shouldn't do again, unless we can judge and say that's wrong, that's something that should not have happened, that's something that our society shouldn't do. Unless we have the capacity, then we won't be able to prevent a second thing like that, or recognize that we should be preventing a thing like that. Put more broadly, without judgment, we cannot function as moral agents, as beings for who are responsible for their actions. We are responsible for our actions, and that presupposes, that requires that we are able to make moral judgments. We are rightly angry with those who despise, oppress, or steamroll over other cultures. That's part of the motivation for moral isolationism. We're rightly indignant at the presence of people that are oppressing other cultures, the imperialists, the colonialists. We look back at what they did and we think something went deeply wrong here. And we are right. Something went deeply wrong there. But it's important to realize that when we do that, when we are outraged at those people that transgress those kinds of cultural barriers, we're in fact making a moral judgments. We're in fact saying that imperialism is wrong, that taking a culture and imposing it upon others with no good reason is something wrong. And that itself is a moral judgment. That's a judgment that transcends cultures. That is something that the very intelligibility of making that claim presupposes that there's a fact of the matter that transcends cultures that we're articulating, namely cultures who respect each other. So this is a moral judgment itself. She ends her article by saying, morally as well as physically, there is only one world. In other words, something like the picture I gave you earlier of the islands, what they're trying to represent, the isolation between cultures and moral systems, is false. We live in the same world. We can walk into a culture that is different and understand what they say. I mean, if we spend time and so on, but we're not sealed units. We're interacting with each other regularly, and we learn from each other. Those are the facts on the ground. And our moral theories should be receptive to those facts. So moral isolationism is not an accurate theory of the things that happen in the world when the ethically related practices and activities we engage in. So that's the end of the article. Before we move on, I want to give you an argument for relativism. It's the only argument for relativism I'll give you. And I'll give you reasons for thinking that the argument is false. So you should be asking yourself, what reasons do I have for thinking that morality is subjective? And what reasons do I have for thinking that morality is subjective? We'll look at more reasons for thinking that morality is subjective later. For now, here is an argument that purports to give you, that tries to give you reason for thinking that morality is relative, and then I'll tell you why it doesn't work. So argument, premise number one, we all have equal moral rights to express our moral beliefs. Seems true. Claim number two, premise number two, these rights establish the equality of our moral views. That's the crucial premise. From that, it follows that everyone's moral beliefs are equal. So you might think that an argument like this, that is grounded in the right of people to have their own opinion, to express their own opinion, an argument like this establishes something like relativism, like morality is just what you take it to be, something like that. What is true to you need not be true to me, morally speaking, and so on. But it doesn't. It's not a good argument. And here are some reasons for showing that it's not a good argument. Criticism number one. The conclusion undermines the first premise. If you look at the first premise again, the only way of making sense of that premise is in objectivist terms. The only way of making sense of that is to say there's an objective fact of the matter. People are equal. A society or person that disagrees with that is wrong. It's doing something, it's mistaken about morality. Part of what that equality amounts to is the equal right to articulate or hold different moral beliefs. But to say that is to make an objectivist claim about reality. In the conclusion, however, is one that undermines the first premise. It says, oh, by the way, all beliefs are on a par. So think of someone who believes that one is false. If someone believes that one is false, 3 seems to say, yeah, that's equally true than my belief that one is true. But then that would render 1 to be both true and false, true relative to me and false relative to that person. In other words, it would undermine the objectivity of 1, which was the very requirement for the argument. So it undermines itself, it just falls apart. And that's, of course, terrible. And here's a second criticism. There's a basic mistake lurking in the background here. there's a distinction, a very important distinction that is blurred here in this argument. It's a distinction between the right to hold your opinion, which is a political right, from the plausibility or credibility or reasonableness of your opinion. The first one, a right to a belief is a political thing. It's something that holds or binds good societies together. And it says something like, it is wrong for others to deny you political benefits like employment, ability to vote, ability to hold political office, property rights, things like that. It is wrong for others to deny you those things on the basis of your personal opinions and beliefs of the matter. Just because you're Republican, no one can or should deny you your property. Just because you're a Democrat, no one can or should deny you your property or your ability to vote and so on. That's wrong. And that's what the we have equal rights amounts to. It's a political right. And that's objective. I mean, at least proponents take it to be objective. But this argument seems to conflate that with the plausibility or credibility of your opinions. The second one, the plausibility or reasonableness of your opinions does not depend, or is something other than your political right to hold your opinions. That depends on evidence and reason. Your opinions may be very well grounded, very well informed, very nuanced and careful, or they may be very ignorant and naive and false. And the fact you have a right to them is perfectly compatible with you being an expert and knowing what you're talking about, and you being completely naive and having a lot of false beliefs. You still have the political right, but the political right does not in any way ensure or grant the reasonableness or the credibility or the plausibility of your beliefs. That's just a different thing. And this argument conflates that. So it does not establish relativism. Relativism is the one that says that all beliefs are on a par on the plausibility level, right? On the reasons for the beliefs category. It's the second kind of plausibility of opinion that is what relativist is talking about. And that just does not follow from the argument. It's a mistake to think so. Okay, well, let's stop here. I'll see you next time.